Professor Jeffrey Sachs, it's a pleasure having you here. Welcome to Belly of the Beast.
Thank you. Great to be with you.
You were recently in Havana. What were your impressions of Cuba?
I love coming to Cuba. This was not the first trip. We had a wonderful time. There's so much culture and music everywhere, which I absolutely love. But the economic situation is extremely difficult. There's clearly a lot of neighborhoods in Havana, which is where I was this trip, that are really dilapidated. Poverty, difficulties. For me, an opportunity also to understand a little bit better about the situation of U.S. Politics vis-a-vis Cuba.
What have the U.S. sanctions meant for a country like Cuba?
Now, the implications of the blockade are very serious. Cuba's income per person is probably a third or a fourth of what it would be without the blockade. I think that it's important to say that the Cuban government has done an exceptionally good job of addressing social needs, the needs for nutrition, for schooling, for healthcare, despite the U.S. blockade. Cuba has been able to survive the blockade, but it's definitely meant more poverty, the lack of ability of Cuba to really be at the forefront of technology and the digital age, which it otherwise would be, because there's so many skilled people, so many trained people, and so on.
Do you think that U.S. sanctions have changed in the last 20 years?
When Trump declared Cuba a sponsor of state terrorism, which is completely preposterous, this tightened up the restrictions. It made it even harder for anybody to do business. It made it harder for banks to do business. So the sanctions are quite strong right now. Of course, there are some cases of trade being made even with the United States, but the sanctions are really restrictive. You know, when I went to Cuba, my university, they needed to make sure that I was in complete compliance with the law in every way. And which hotel are you staying at? And you can't stay here, and only this list, and you can't do this, and you can't do that. They're quite restrictive. And we followed the rules because that's our law, but the law is stupid and it's harmful.
What has been the impact of Cuba being on the state sponsor of terrorism list?
As soon as that was made, and that was, again, not a vote of Congress, that was just an executive order of Trump. As soon as that happened, even projects that had been going on, even some banking relations, even some tourism, some cruise ships, for example, that had been visiting, everything stopped because that was really an escalation. And it was completely arbitrary. It wasn't based on anything, just Trump being Trump. But Biden, because he's a coward, didn't change it.
Are sanctions more deadly in Cuba than they are in other countries like Venezuela, Russia, Iran, for example?
The sanctions have been longer lasting for Cuba. In this sense, they've had a pernicious effect over many decades. The sanctions for Venezuela were very harsh and did a lot of damage, mainly because they prevented Venezuela from even maintaining its oil output. And so the revenues of the government collapsed. In the case of Russia, the sanctions really didn't work very well because Russia was able to change its trade relations with other countries. It shifted its oil sales, for example, from Europe to India and to China. And so Russia, by being bigger and having an ability to shift its exports pretty quickly, really didn't get hit by the sanctions the same way. But Venezuela took a very big hit.
Critics of the Cuban government say the embargo is not a big deal because Cuba can just do business with the rest of the world. Is there any truth to that?
That's a complete lie and a complete irresponsibility. American politicians are completely irresponsible. The one that was most responsible for the bloqueo in recent years is under arrest and on his way to jail, most likely. Menendez of New Jersey, he's just a gangster. He's a criminal, and he used the blockade for uh, hustling, for money, for personal gain, for political gain. But politicians or those who say, "Oh, it's the fault of the Cuban government," "Oh, it doesn't have any effect." Well, that's absurd. If it doesn't have any effect, lift it. The reason that they keep it on is that they know that it hurts. And that's actually really sadistic. The American policy is based on hurting Cuba, based on hurting Cubans. But it has nothing to do with the views of the American people, and it makes no economic sense, and it hurts the American people too.
Can you talk about the compliance with the financial institutions?
Basically, the reach of the US dollar is very strong, and banks that need to deal in dollars are afraid to deal with Cuba. Even if they're not dealing in dollars with Cuba, they are dealing in dollars with other countries. So they're afraid of secondary sanctions from the United States. So people who say, well, that's just the US, let them trade with Europe, let them trade with Canada. This isn't the way it works, because those businesses also have US based dealings. They have dollar based dealings, just about every major company does. And they're afraid of getting slapped with sanctions from the US. And so the US reach goes because of the dollar based system. Maybe the BRICS countries, when China, Brazil, Russia, India, South Africa, and the other BRICS countries create a non-dollar payment system, this will give some new avenues for Cuba. But right now, the dollar is the main way that trade gets done. And so banks anywhere in the world don't want to do business. So you can't do credit cards. You can't do normal trade. You can't do trade financing. Even ships won't come to Havana because then they can't go on to the United States. Everything about their trade is restricted. And so everything is made hard. And people who say it has no effect don't understand anything.
Yeah, I always say that. Okay, maybe I'm wrong, but the way to prove that I'm wrong and the people are wrong and the sanctions are not real at all is just lift it. It's a
Exactly. If
win-win.
it's not doing anything, if it's not harming people, then just lift it.
Do you think that there is a country that can survive like so long as Cuba under U.S. sanctions?
Well, Cuba is very impressive because this has been going on for more than 6 decades. Despite everything, despite the impoverishment that has been driven into Cuba by the US policies in some places, despite the lack of foreign investment, the difficulties of trade, the social standards, the culture, the resilience is very, very strong. The United States is completely isolated diplomatically in this. And you have a vote in the General Assembly every year, and the United States just ignores all the international rules. Well, that hurts the United States a lot. And whenever the Americans are told about all of this, because they don't really hear about it very much, but when they are told about it, they say, oh, come on, we're in 2024. Are you kidding? Why do we have sanctions that go back to 1958, 1959,
Yeah.
or not 58, 59, 60, 61? They're shocked about it. They don't know about it, but they're shocked about it.
Why has the U.S. sanctioned Cuba for so long? What is the goal of the sanctions?
And I think it's a combination of corruption, like Menendez, and Florida politics. That's all. It's not the demands of the American people. They don't like it. They don't want it. People want to go visit Cuba.
Yeah.
It's our neighbor. They want culture, good music, great fun, great beaches. They want to go see. And by the way, there are lots of Cuban Americans that want to visit their families more easily, that want to have normal trade, that want to make businesses. So
Yeah, of
this is
course.
not popular. This is not to anybody's benefit except Menendez, who's a thug, and Marco Rubio, who wants to be king of Dade County.
Professor, for me, it's really hard to understand because the sanctions are older than Menendez being in power. What is so special about Cuba that US government has been trying to overthrow like Cuban government because that requires energy, that requires money. So why?
Basically, the U.S. is a bully. It's a bully anywhere in the world, all over the world. It overthrows governments regularly. And Cuba had the nerve to say, no, we're not going to be overthrown. We're going to do it our way. And that really annoys a bully. It's like saying, you can't bully us. And so that attitude is what gets these politicians like Biden. But the truth is, even that isn't really the explanation anymore. Biden once said, I don't want to take on Menendez, and I don't want to take him on. Now Menendez is going to jail, so maybe this will end. But basically, this is a few people who run the show. This is not the American people. This is not some great ideological escapade. Maybe because the state of Florida is probably more reliably Republican now, not even a swing state, although we'll see. Maybe the Democrats, won't care so much about these sanctions anymore. But this is a game like the United States plays games all over the world, but it's a game with a huge cost, a huge social cost, a huge cost to real people. But believe me, these politicians in the United States don't think about real people. They think about power. They think about gimmicks. They think about the vote in the state of Florida. They think about the money that they're going to get for campaign contributions. These are not decent people, I'm afraid, that put this and keep this policy in place.
Do you have any insight into why Biden has embraced Trump's war era policy toward Cuba instead of bringing back the Obama policy of engagement? Because Bob Menendez right now is
Yes.
out of the picture.
Yeah, basically, Biden's a coward. And so he doesn't stand up for principles on almost any front. He's kept the Cold War attitudes everywhere. He is afraid of being attacked from the right wing. He's, of course, maybe thinking in some remote chance he's going to win the state of Florida. But he's basically a coward. And that's true on foreign policy across the board.
Who is running the shit when it comes to Biden's policy on Cuba?
Well, it was Menendez up until Menendez's arrest. Probably it's a couple political advisors who say, "Oh, don't get into it. Nobody cares. You'll get criticized from the right. Trump will criticize you. It'll hurt the state of Florida. Maybe Marco Rubio will criticize you." Basically, Biden doesn't have principles when it comes to foreign policy.
Have you had the opportunity to talk to someone inside of the Biden administration and say, okay, this is wrong. We need to do it better.
Well, they've heard me because I've spoken in many forums about this in the UN and the Human Rights Council and elsewhere. I have such a large list of complaints about the Biden administration that I don't think they're listening to me anymore because I'm complaining not only about Cuba, but about Ukraine, about the Middle East, about China, because they don't want to hear from me. They know I complain. But the truth is they're not doing it right. This is really the main point.
Is there a way that Cuba can progress economically even when it's subject to sanctions?
The Cuban government's done a very good job of maintaining uh, the social services, maintaining the focus on health, maintaining the focus on education, maintaining the focus on nutrition, uh, maintaining the focus on culture. So the Cuban government's been very resilient for a long time in this, but a lot of prosperity depends on trade, on finance, on tourism, on connectivity. So I think that there are limits to what the government can do on its own. I think it's important for Cuba to reach out to all the rest of the neighborhood, other than the U.S. at least, to Mexico, very importantly, to Central America, to the rest of the Caribbean, of South America, and say, look, at least we need normal relations with you, and let's figure out the payments problems, the finance problems, the ways around the U.S. sanctions. I think there's something that can be done on that.
These countries, for example, in the Caribbean, doesn't depend of United States or US dollars too.
Of course they're vulnerable, but on the other hand, the United States cannot just say to the whole neighborhood, we don't care, we don't listen to you, we determine everything. If the rest of the neighborhood says, look, this isn't working for us, and there are many things that are not working for the Caribbean more generally, there are many things that are not working for Mexico and Central America, the whole region has trouble that it doesn't need to have. And it needs to say also to the United States, look, we need a rational, balanced relationship. Because remember, it's not only Cuba, like you said, it's Venezuela. Big sanctions regime did a lot of damage to Venezuela, but it did a lot of damage throughout the region. And then people migrate to the US, and the US says, oh my God, we have so much migration. Well, come on, we need development in the region. We don't need this kind of self-inflicted punishment or artificial punishment. And so I do think that the region can have a voice, but it needs to be a voice together, because if Cuba tries alone, we know what happened. But if the whole region together raises its voice and says, hey, this isn't working, stop bullying, and let's work out together how we can make something work for everybody, I think there's some chance of that.
But we don't have that solution yet.
Not yet, but we're going to keep working.